We end this lecture with some concluding remarks. The success of Bitcoin is actually quite remarkable if you consider all the ventures that failed at trying to do what Bitcoin does, which is create an electronic payment system. Of all the unique contributions of Bitcoin, the one contribution that is probably the most useful, not just for Bitcoin, but it's been ported to other technologies and altcoins, is the blockchain. No other proposal for eCash had a solution like the blockchain in it. Another thing that Bitcoin succeeded at is they launched with user-to-user transactions as well as supporting user-to-merchant transactions. The lack of support for user-to-user transaction is a reason why a lot of the early eCash systems failed, because you needed merchants to get on board with the system. You needed the banks to get on board with the system. In Bitcoin's case, since it supported user-to-user transactions, then in the early days of Bitcoin, when merchants weren't interested in using it, there still was a use for Bitcoin. It was still useful for something, and they acquired a lot of users who formed a community that would advocate for merchants to start accepting Bitcoin. And so by allowing user-to-user transaction, it allowed them to get through this transitionary period where merchants started accepting it. Another unique aspect of Bitcoin that no other proposal made, at least not explicitly, is the idea of using public keys as people's identities instead of real names. In this case, it maintains a certain level of anonymity, and in past lectures in this series, we've looked at the anonymity of Bitcoin and how much anonymity it actually provides. But if you're careful and diligent about using fresh Bitcoin addresses, then you can maintain some aspect of anonymity. Okay? This level of anonymity is, in some sense, weaker than a lot of the previous proposals, but in some sense it's stronger. One of the proposals that strongly advocated anonymity was Chom's eCash, which was realized by DigiCash. But even in that system, it was only the senders of the money that maintained their anonymity. It wasn't the merchants. In Bitcoin, we have pseudonymity, but both the senders and the merchants, or the receivers, whether they're users or merchants, they maintain the same level of pseudonymity. Here are some final lessons that we can learn from Bitcoin as through the lens of the previous systems that we've looked at. The first is to not give up on a problem. Just because people failed for 15 years or 20 years at developing eCash systems, it doesn't mean that there isn't a solution out there that would work. Satoshi worked through the fact that these proposals had failed. A lot of people didn't take Bitcoin very seriously in the early days because it looked just like another proposal to add to the list of proposals that failed. But eventually, he won everyone over with the ideas, and it succeeded. The second is to being willing to compromise. If you want perfect anonymity or perfect decentralization, or if you want to have transactions that are perfectly offline without having to broadcast them to some peer-to-peer network, if your goal is perfection, then you're going to have to compromise in other areas of the protocol, and you probably aren't going to end up with a very useful protocol in the end. So Bitcoin is interesting because it compromises in the right ways. It scales back anonymity a little bit to pseudonymity, and it requires online transactions where effectively you're connected to a peer-to-peer network. But with those sort of compromises in place, it allows Bitcoin to do a lot of other interesting things that allowed it to succeed. The final thing I'll say about Bitcoin is that it had success through numbers. Bitcoin was able to build up a community, both a community of users who were passionate about Bitcoin and developers who were willing to contribute to the open source technology. This is a markedly different approach than previous attempts at eCash, where they were usually developed by a company, and the only advocates for the technology were the employees of the company itself. To a large extent, Bitcoin's success relies on the fact that they had a strong supporting community who pushed the technology, got people using it, and got merchants to adopt it.